The Judiciary Committee will come to order, and without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the committee at any time. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1147 for purposes of markup and move that the committee report the bill favorably to the House. The clerk will report the bill.
H.R. 1147, to amend the Immigration and Nationality Act to make mandatory and permanent requirements relating to use of an electronic employment eligibility verification system and for other purposes.
Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point, and I'll begin by recognizing myself for an opening statement. The American people want our immigration laws to be enforced. In the past, they were promised tougher enforcement in exchange for the legalization of those unlawfully in the U.S., but administrations never kept these promises, and today we are left with a broken immigration system. One way to make sure we discourage illegal immigration in the future is to prevent unlawful immigrants from getting jobs in the U.S. Requiring the use of E-Verify by all employers across the country will help do just that. The web-based program is a reliable and fast way for employers to electronically check the work eligibility of newly hired employees. H.R. 1147, the Legal Workforce Act, builds on E-Verify's success and finally implements one part of the strong enforcement that was promised to the American people many years ago. The Legal Workforce Act does not simply leave enforcement up to the federal government. In fact, it actually empowers states to help enforce the E-Verify requirement, ensuring that we do not continue the mistakes of the past where a president can turn off federal enforcement efforts unilaterally. Nearly 580,000 employers are currently signed up to use E-Verify. It is easy for employers to use, and it is effective. In fact, as USCIS has testified in front of this committee, E-Verify immediately confirms work-eligible employees 99.7% of the time. But the current system is not perfect. For instance, in cases of identity theft, when an individual submits stolen identity documents and information, E-Verify may confirm the work eligibility of that individual. This happens because E-Verify uses a Social Security number and certain other corresponding identifying information, such as the name and date of birth of an individual, to determine if a person submitting the Social Security number is work eligible. Thus, if an individual uses a stolen Social Security number and the real name corresponding with that Social Security number, a false positive result could occur. The Legal Workforce Act addresses identity theft in several ways. First, it requires notification to the rightful owner of a Social Security number whenever that number is submitted to E-Verify in a manner indicating a pattern of unusual multiple use. The rightful owner of the Social Security number will know that his or her number may have been compromised. And once they confirm this, the Department of Homeland Security and the Social Security Administration must lock that Social Security number so no one else can use it for employment eligibility purposes. Among other things, the bill also creates a program through which parents or legal guardians can lock the Social Security numbers of their minor children for work eligibility purposes. This is to combat the rise in the number of thefts of children's identities. The bill also phases in E-Verify use in 6-month increments, beginning with the largest U.S. businesses, raises penalties for employers who do not use E-Verify according to the requirements, allows employers to use E-Verify prior to the date they hired an employee, and provides meaningful safe harbors for employers who use the system in good faith. I understand that some in the agricultural industry do not support the Legal Workforce Act because they prefer it to be moved at the same time as an agricultural guest worker program. And I remain just as committed to moving such a guest worker program through this committee as I was last Congress. Unfortunately, the President has tied our hands by not only refusing to enforce immigration laws, but also by trying to unilaterally rewrite the laws to implement policies to allow millions of unlawful immigrants to remain in the U.S. and get work authorization. The American people are demanding immigration enforcement prior to any legal immigration reforms. So the first immigration-related bills the committee must mark up this Congress are dedicated to interior immigration enforcement. That in no way diminishes the need for a workable agricultural guest worker program, and in no way diminishes my commitment to having this committee consider such a bill as soon as possible. H.R. 1147 balances the needs of the American people regarding immigration enforcement with the needs of the business community regarding a fair and workable electronic employment verification system. I urge my colleagues to support the bill today, and I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, the ranking member of the Immigration and Border Security Subcommittee, Ms. Lofgren, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The bill we're considering today is not unfamiliar to many of us on the committee. The Immigration Subcommittee has held many hearings over the years about E-Verify, and the committee has marked up the Legal Workforce Act, or variations of it, in the last two Congresses. Each time we mark this bill up, it changes a little bit. When we marked up the Legal Workforce Act in the 112th Congress, the bill exempted returning seasonal farm workers from having to be verified upon hire. This giant loophole came under attack from all sides. From the right, it was attacked as amnesty, and from the left, it was attacked as an admission that E-Verify alone would destroy our agricultural industry and the millions of jobs held by U.S. workers that are supported by that industry. The committee struck this provision from the bill during markup. It continues to be omitted from the bill. The version that we considered in the 112th Congress also created new criminal penalties for unlawful conduct that were both excessive and wasteful. In addition to imposing multiple mandatory minimum prison terms, the bill made it a felony punishable by up to 15 years in prison for a person to use a Social Security number that did not belong to him or her during the employment verification process. The version of the bill that we reported during the last Congress changed several of the criminal provisions pertaining to fraud and misuse of documents and contained no mandatory minimum prison terms. The version that we considered in the 113th Congress contained changes to make E-Verify more workable for the Social Security Administration, which serves a number of other critically important functions. And the version that we're considering today contains two new provisions to relieve some of the burdens that small businesses are expected to face disproportionately once they're required to use E-Verify. I'm sure we'll discuss small businesses more today, since they have been the heart of our economy and job recovery in recent years. But I did want to recognize the steps taken to address concerns that we raised during the last Congress. Having said that, today's bill still contains several of the greatest flaws of the bill that we've addressed in past markups. First, the bill continues to provide no meaningful due process protections for authorized workers who lose their jobs because of erroneous final non-confirmations. The idea that Americans and authorized immigrants will lose their jobs as a result of this bill is not simply theoretical. Although we know that the government continues to work hard to reduce error rates in E-Verify, errors absolutely still exist. USCIS testified before the Immigration Subcommittee last Congress that an estimated 0.3% of the authorized workers, that's U.S. citizens and others, receive tentative non-confirmations through the system and must follow up with DHS or Social Security in order to avoid losing their jobs. Now, a 0.3% error rate sounds very small, but the real-world impact on new and existing hires could be quite dramatic. By requiring verification of all newly hired workers, approximately 54 million people each year, and permitting re-verification of all current workers, approximately 155 million, a 0.3% error rate would place between 162,000 to 465,000 American citizens and authorized non-citizens at risk of losing their jobs or job opportunities due to errors. And while the error rate for U.S. citizens continues to improve, the error rate for non-citizens has been constant and disproportionately high. Westat Corporation reported in 2012 that the error rate for U.S. citizens in fiscal year 09 was 0.2%. For permanent residents, the error rate was 0.7%, and for all other work-authorized non-citizens, it was 4.2%. Of course, many of these people will be able to correct the erroneous tentative non-confirmation, but many will not. Without adequate due process protections, people will lose their jobs incorrectly and be without meaningful recourse. The bill also provides no penalties at all for employers who violate the requirement that they inform an employee about a tentative non-confirmation so that the employee can correct the error. Although USCIS now provides direct notice of such non-confirmations to persons who provide an email address on their Form I-9s, only 12% of all tentative non-confirmations issued in fiscal year 14 were provided to employees via email. The vast majority were provided only to employers, which means the ability of an employee who receives an erroneous tentative non-confirmation to correct the error and avoid termination rests solely in the hands of those employers. The absence of any consequence for an employer who fails to provide notice to a worker renders that notice requirement toothless. Finally, the point I hope every member understands is that we can only advance a bill like this together with necessary reforms to our broken immigration system. We could design the best E-Verify system imaginable, a system that's easy to use, 100% accurate, available at virtually no cost to big and small businesses alike. But if we imposed that system nationwide and did nothing to fix our broken immigration system, the consequences would be disastrous. The point is most easily demonstrated. We consider that 50 to 70% of farm workers are undocumented. Without reform, expanding E-Verify would devastate the agricultural economy, resulting in closed farms, a less secure America, and mass offshoring of millions and millions of U.S. jobs, including all of the upstream and downstream jobs created and supported by agriculture. Expanding E-Verify alone would also increase the deficit and decrease tax revenues. Last Congress, the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation concluded that the Legal Workforce Act would have resulted in a net revenue loss of $39 billion over 10 years. So I will ask unanimous consent to place the rest of my statement into the record, Mr. Chairman, but I would just note that when it comes to ag, if you do E-Verify, you're going to find something out that we already know. The workers are undocumented, we need them, and if they are forced to leave, agriculture will collapse. I yield back.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Smith, the author of the legislation, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for your comments and for bringing this bill up for markup today. Almost 20 million Americans are unemployed or underemployed. Meanwhile, 7 million people are working in the United States illegally. These jobs should go to American citizens and legal immigrants. The Legal Workforce Act turns off the jobs magnet that attracts so many illegal immigrants to the United States. The bill expands the E-Verify system and applies it to all U.S. employers. Illegal workers cost American jobs or depress their wages, according to nearly all studies on the subject. For example, illegal immigration reduces the wages of American workers by an average of $650 per worker, with unskilled workers hit the hardest. We need to do all we can to protect the jobs and wages of American workers. The Legal Workforce Act also would open up millions of jobs for unemployed Americans by requiring employers to use E-Verify. The E-Verify system is quick and effective, confirming 99.7% of work-eligible employees. I don't know of a more effective or efficient government program. Recent data shows that almost 600,000 American employers voluntarily use E-Verify, and an average of 1,400 new businesses sign up each week. 1/3 of American jobs are now covered by E-Verify. The program is free, quick, and easy to use. In fact, E-Verify will soon be available for use on smartphones. It takes about 1 minute. Individuals provide their Social Security number when they visit a doctor, open a bank account, or buy a home. It makes sense that other businesses should check the status of prospective employees to ensure they have a legal workforce. The Legal Workforce Act requires that U.S. employers use E-Verify to check the work eligibility of new hires in the U.S. The verification period is phased in and depends on the size of the employer's business. Smaller businesses have up to 2 years to implement E-Verify. Agriculture businesses have 3. The legislation balances immigration enforcement priorities and legitimate employer concerns. It gives employers a workable system under which they cannot be held liable if they use the system in good faith. The bill prevents a patchwork of state E-Verify laws, but retains the ability of states and localities to condition business licenses on the use of E-Verify. It also allows states to enforce the federal E-Verify requirement if the federal government fails to do so. The Legal Workforce Act increases penalties on employers who knowingly violate the requirements of E-Verify and imposes criminal penalties on employers and employees who engage in or facilitate identity theft. The bill creates a fully electronic employment eligibility verification system, and it allows employers to voluntarily check their current workforce if done in a non-discriminatory manner. Furthermore, the Legal Workforce Act gives U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services the ability to prevent identity theft. The bill allows individuals to lock their own Social Security number so that it cannot be used by others to verify work eligibility. The legislation also enables parents to lock the Social Security number of a minor child to prevent identity theft. If a Social Security number shows unusual multiple uses, the Social Security Administration locks the number for employment verification purposes and notifies the owner that their personal information may be compromised. In regard to cost, one study showed that 3/4 of employers stated the cost of using E-Verify is zero. Equally important, the American people support E-Verify. Polls show that from 71% to 85% of voters, quote, support Congress passing new legislation that strengthens the rules making it illegal for businesses in the U.S. to hire illegal immigrants, end quote. In fact, E-Verify receives the most public support of any proposed immigration reform. This bill is a common-sense approach that will reduce illegal immigration and save jobs for legal workers. It deserves the support of everyone who wants to put the interest of American workers first. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan, the ranking member of the committee, Mr. Conyers, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Goodlatte. Members of the committee, today we began the process of marking up 4 deportation-only bills that would have the effect of separating families, strip protection from dreamers, destroy the agricultural industry and the millions of jobs that depend on it, and return vulnerable children to face persecution and violence from whence they came. Our nation, I'm not going to repeat this again, it's been said so many times. You know what our nation's immigration system is. It's broken. It doesn't work for American families, businesses, or the economy. These problems require real legislative solutions, and the approach that the committee is taking this week, in my view, falls far, far short of what we need. Start with H.R. 1147, the Legal Workforce Act, which would make E-Verify, the electronic employment verification system, mandatory for all employers. Do you remember that we've considered this bill twice before? And I have previously said that E-Verify is an important tool. But the truth is we can't require all employers to use E-Verify if we do not also adopt comprehensive reforms to our nation's broken immigration system. There, I said it again, and reform E-Verify itself. We're likely to hear today that the E-Verify will help American workers because every time an undocumented immigrant is denied a job, an unemployed American can get hired. Come on now, we know better than that. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Immigrants fill major gaps in our workforce. This is particularly evident in agriculture, where sometimes over 2/3 of the on-the-field farm workers lack immigration status. If we mandated the use of E-Verify without also providing an opportunity for those experienced, undocumented farm workers to fill essential jobs, here's what we'd see. Farms across the nation would be forced out of business, pure and simple. Americans would turn to foreign markets to import our fruits and vegetables. And millions of upstream and downstream American jobs supported by agriculture would be lost. Additionally, we must also ensure that this legislation sufficiently protects American citizens and work-authorized non-citizens so that they're not inappropriately prohibited from working. It is true that the measure before us today contains several requirements intended to protect American workers. For example, it prohibits employers from using E-Verify until after a job offer has been extended, and employers must inform workers when the system returns a tentative non-confirmation. Also, employers can't rescind job offers or fire workers until they get a chance to fix any errors. However, the bill lacks any penalties for failing to follow these guidelines. And we know that employers who currently use the system already frequently do not comply with current requirements. So why would this be any different? Should E-Verify becomes mandatory? I don't think it would be much different. And finally, the bill offers no real protections for U.S. citizens and other work-authorized persons who are incorrectly identified as unauthorized to work. I will put the rest of my statement in the record, and I thank the chairman.
Chair thanks the gentleman from Michigan, and the committee will stand in recess until 1 p.m.
I wasn't going to hear her anyway. I mean, you know I'm not going.
The committee will reconvene. When the committee recessed, we were considering H.R. 1147, had heard the opening statements. Any additional opening statements will be made a part of the record, and are there amendments?
Mr. Chairman,
For purposes, the gentleman from Iowa seek recognition.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1147, offered by Mr. King.
For purposes, the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Point of order is reserved. Clerk will report the amendment.
Add at the end of the bill the following. Section 15, clarification that wages paid to unauthorized aliens.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman from Iowa is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is an amendment that fits right into the underlying bill and is the logical connection to the general scope of the underlying bill. It's a bill that I introduced over the last several Congresses called the New IDEA Act. And the New IDEA Act, the acronym IDEA, stands for the Illegal Deduction Elimination Act. And as I was thinking this through several years ago, I'm wondering to myself, if we can't get the Social Security Administration to enforce the law, if we can't get the Department of Homeland Security to enforce the law, and now, ever more importantly, a president who has ordered the Department of Homeland Security not to enforce the law, and in some cases actually violate the law, what agency strikes fear into the heart of people that need to have respect for the rule of law? Well, there's only one that I can think of, and that's the Internal Revenue Service. And so as one who is a great respecter of the tools of the Internal Revenue Service, I began to search for a way that we could bring the IRS into the enforcement of our immigration law. And so that's where the acronym, the Illegal Deduction Elimination Act, comes from, is that it clarifies that wages and benefits that are paid to those who cannot lawfully work in the United States are not tax deductible for federal income tax purposes. It clarifies that fact. And then from that point, it says to the employers, though, it's your choice on whether you want to take a risk on losing the business deduction on your Schedule C of your wage and benefits that are paid to illegals, or if you want to be at risk of the IRS coming in during a normal audit. This bill doesn't accelerate the audit, but during a normal audit, and through that audit, they would put the Social Security numbers and the identifiers through E-Verify. If it came back that those employees could legally work according to E-Verify, that would then give the employer safe harbor, so it's not mandatory under the E-Verify component of this bill, as the underlying bill is. It's voluntary. But there's a 6-year statute of limitations so that you accumulate that liability over a period of 6 years. That gives the employers an opportunity to clean up their workforce incrementally or all at once or in any sequence that they choose. And so we also, of course, give the employer a safe harbor if he uses E-Verify. Another component of this is that the Social Security Administration, the Department of Homeland Security, and the IRS are required to put together a cooperative committee and exchange information so that the right hand, the left hand, and the middle hand of government all know what the other is doing. And another component is that when you calculate this from a business perspective, and if I'm an employer that didn't happen to just simply say the standard is I only hire legal employees, I believe that has been our standard now for 40 years in King Construction. We've only hired legal employees. But if you were paying presumably $10 an hour for an illegal employee, but you had to run the risk of an IRS audit that might, by the time they did the audit and if they rejected an employee at $10 an hour, the interest and the penalty and the tax liability falls in the range of $6. So you're looking at not a $10 an hour business expense, but a $16 an hour business expense if E-Verify, or excuse me, if the new IDEA Act would be implemented into law. This is actually a simple solution to a complex problem. It doesn't rely upon the President of the United States ordering DHS to go in and inspect and audit an employee or an employer. What it does instead is it allows for the sequence of normal IRS audits to provide an incentive for all employers to clean up their workforce. You never know when the IRS is going to come in with an audit. And if you know that 6 years from enactment that they can go back 6 years and you would have that 6-year liability, it becomes a cumulative, powerful incentive for the employers to clean up their workforce because they get safe harbor with E-Verify. This is a bill that's been jointly referred to the Judiciary and to the Ways and Means Committee, and I recognize there's some question about the jurisdiction of this, and I expect that I will be listening to a compelling argument in a moment. But, Mr. Chairman, that's my advance of this amendment, and I yield back, and I urge its adoption and yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Does the gentleman from Pennsylvania insist on his point of order?
Yes, I do insist on my point of order.
Gentleman is recognized.
Chairman and my good friend, there's no one that wants to see the IRS dismantled more than I do. But this amendment makes changes to the Internal Revenue Code, a statute that is within the jurisdiction of the Ways and Means Committee. And because this section amending the Internal Revenue Codes are outside the jurisdiction of this committee, I insist on my point of order. And I yield back.
Does the gentleman from Iowa wish to respond to the point of
Mr.
order?
Chairman, yes, and
Gentleman is recognized.
I appreciate being recognized. I think there's an argument here that I have not heard presented before this committee with regard to the jurisdiction of this committee and the germaneness of this particular amendment. And looking back through the history books, in 1902, there was a bill to regulate immigration of aliens in the United States, and Representative Oscar W. Wood proposed an amendment providing an education qualification since there wasn't one in the bill. Well, the ruling of the chair at that time, not that long ago, was that, and I quote from the chair, quote, "Any amendment to this bill, in the opinion of the chair, is clearly and distinctly connected logically with the general scope and intent of the bill would be germane," and did rule so. So I think we have a broader interpretation here of what's in order, but also I would be willing to listen to a compelling argument on the part of the chairman if he should be happy to yield to that opinion.
Well, first of all, let me say to the gentleman, I thank him for his amendment. I, as he knows, am a supporter of the concept lying behind the amendment, but the chair is prepared to rule on the point of order.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
If I could reclaim my time, I think then rather than submit to the ruling on the point of order, I would ask unanimous consent to withdraw my amendment. And
Well, the chair thanks the gentleman, and without objection, the amendment is withdrawn. Are there further amendments to H.R. 1147? For what purpose does the gentleman from California seek recognition?
I ask unanimous consent to enter into the record 18 letters. Can I describe them?
Yeah, just list them, I guess.
Just really quickly, I didn't mean to take time. Signed by 70 different organizations in opposition to H.R. 1147, written by the following organizations: Hager Farms, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, the National Immigration Law Center, the Ag Workforce Coalition, the American Farm Bureau Federation, the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, Coalition for Humane Immigrant Rights of Los Angeles, Service Employees International Union, Network, Disciples of Christ, Fair Immigration Reform Movement, the Advocates for Human Rights, National Council of Asian Pacific Americans, We Belong Together, the National Immigration Forum, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and the Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Without objection, they will be made a part of the record. Are there further amendments? For purpose, the gentlewoman from Washington seek recognition.
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1147, offered by Ms. Del Bene of Washington. In Section 2, in the
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Agriculture is a key part of Washington State's economy, and my district has thousands of farms producing millions of dollars worth of goods and employing thousands of people. And in addition to serving on this committee, I'm a member of the Agriculture Committee, and I've had the privilege of being a voice here in D.C. for Washington's local farmers and our food producers. Today, I speak in the strongest terms against the mandatory use of E-Verify that H.R. 1147 seeks to impose on employers in the ag sector. This bill represents a misguided, enforcement-only approach to solving our nation's immigration challenges, and it would have a disastrous impact on farmers in my district and across the country. Imposing mandatory E-Verify on the agricultural sector without simultaneously enacting a legislative solution to address farmers' labor needs would create massive disruptions in a critical sector of the U.S. economy, harming American jobs, crippling our agricultural output, and all the while failing to move the country closer to a permanent solution that takes into account unique labor challenges associated with this sector of the economy. While this year's three-year timeline for agricultural employers, up from 2 last time we considered this proposal, is some acknowledgement of these challenges, the extension is far from adequate given the scope of the disruption farmers would face. Comprehensive immigration reform is the only way to accomplish meaningful change without creating economic instability in farming communities across America, but leadership has repeatedly refused to allow this approach. So today, I'm offering an amendment to the Legal Workforce Act that will require the Secretary of Homeland Security, in consultation with the Secretary of Agriculture, to certify that the requirement to verify agricultural employees will not cause significant labor shortages for the sector. Additionally, my amendment would strike the 3-year compliance timeline and instead provide that verification would not be required until this certification is made. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment, and with it, the farmers in our communities who are putting food on our tables, creating jobs, and contributing billions of dollars a year to the U.S. economy. And I yield back.
Chair, thanks, gentlewoman. For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I oppose this amendment because it prevents implementation of E-Verify's required use for the agricultural industry until such time as the DHS Secretary and the Agricultural Secretary certify that the use of E-Verify, quote, will not cause a significant shortage of persons available to perform, end quote, agricultural labor or services in the United States. H.R. 1147 is one in a series of steps on the way to a broader fix to our broken immigration system. And I hope the gentlewoman from Washington is aware of this committee's, and I think I speak for the chairman's, commitment to providing the agricultural industry with a workable system through which to get needed workers. And H.R. 1147 gives agricultural employers 36 months from the date of enactment, longer than any other employer, before they have to start using E-Verify for their newly hired agricultural employees. But this amendment is not just about delaying implementation of E-Verify until it is deemed that there will not be a shortage of agricultural workers. The amendment actually leaves up to the secretaries the determination of whether a shortage would be created. So implementation of E-Verify would be subject to the whim of whomever happens to be the Secretary of DHS and the Secretary of Agriculture. If those individuals happen to be opposed to the use of E-Verify in general, there is an incentive never to certify that a shortage of workers will not be created. This provision abrogates Congress's role in determining immigration policy, so I urge my colleagues to support it and yield back.
If the gentleman would yield.
I'll be happy to yield to the chairman of the
I
committee.
thank the gentleman, and I share his concern and join him in opposing the amendment, but I do want to say to the gentlewoman that I think that, as I stated very thoroughly in my opening statement, I agree that we need to do an agricultural guest worker bill to address these employment needs. But I think in the circumstances we find ourselves in, the American people, and I think the majority of this committee believe that we need to address immigration enforcement measures first. And so that is why we are taking up this measure and why I cannot support her amendment, but I'll work with her moving forward in the future on making sure that those needs are addressed.
Mr. Chairman,
For purpose, the gentlewoman from California seek recognition.
strike last word.
Gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I think this is one of the most important amendments we'll be considering today, and I thank the gentlelady for introducing it. Delaying the verification requirement until we actually have a system that works in ag is very important. And if we don't do this, at least delay the application to seasonal farm workers until we have confidence that the industry won't be decimated. You know, in Georgia and Alabama, mandatory E-Verify did extensive damage to the state's farmers and ag industry. Without other reforms, the nationwide E-Verify would cause just huge disruptions. Now, 50 to 70% of the on-the-field farm workers lack immigration status, and the percentage appears to be growing. Losing 1 to 1.5 million workers would devastate American farms. There are nowhere near 1 to 1.5 million U.S. workers who are willing and able to fill these jobs. As you'll recall, in Georgia, who mandated E-Verify, they lost so many farm workers that Governor Nathan Deal was forced to try to get convicts or ex-convicts to fill the jobs, and the Georgia Agribusiness Council reported that they lost $300 million. In Alabama, which had a similar scheme, some farmers reported they lost half of their workforce. So rather than just move ahead, we should stop and do as the gentlelady's amendment suggests. You know, Chuck Connor of the National Council of Farm Cooperatives testified on this bill earlier, saying that it would not work unless we had an ag program in place. Katie Hager of the Hager Farms in Underwood, North Dakota, wrote to Congress just last week to express strong opposition to the bill, and this is what she asked. Do we want to import workers or import food? Finally, the Agricultural Workforce Coalition wrote to this committee just yesterday to express their strong opposition to the Legal Workforce Act. They conclude by saying that the Legal Workforce Act, as it is, does not address the workforce crisis, and they urge the committee not to advance this measure until these challenges are met. I note that the chairman in the last Congress had a temporary agricultural worker bill that he thought was workable, and much as I respect the chairman, no one else in the world appeared to think it was workable, and we never did pass it to the floor. I do think to proceed on this basis is a huge mistake. And what will happen? We will E-Verify that workforce. We'll find out what we already know, which is 2/3 of them are undocumented, and they will have to leave. And the farmers will be left holding the bag, or should I say, the bag of rotten vegetables. This is a mistake to proceed. I hope that we adopt the gentlelady's very sensible amendment. And with that, I would yield to the gentlelady if she has additional comments.
I just wanted to add that Congressman Deutsch also joined with me to introduce this amendment, and I know would like to speak to it. Hopefully he'll join us soon.
With that then, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlewoman. For purposes, the gentleman from California seeker.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, you and I agree on virtually everything that we deal with in this committee. You and I agree, I believe, 100% on the need for universal E-Verify as part of a comprehensive system in which people who have a right to have a job get a job, and people who are not entitled to work in the United States are told to go elsewhere. So I support the underlying bill, and I will oppose this amendment. But I want to take a moment on behalf of Congresswoman excuse me, Del Bene, to say she's right. We cannot move this bill in a vacuum. We must, and I reach out to my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, we must start with the, if possible, with the base bill that you moved in the last Congress, Mr. Chairman, on ag jobs. Dust off Howard Berman's good work many years ago for ag jobs, a Democratic-supported bill that I was a co-sponsor of, and figure out if we can't, in fact, carve a good piece of legislation for our farmers around the country. I'm not going to say that Howard's bill is perfect. It's been many years. The chairman's bill, I tried to amend even when it was here last year. But I would reach out to my colleague from Washington and say, on behalf of all of my farmers in avocados and tomatoes, in citrus, we need reform. We are employing in Southern California disproportionately people who are undocumented. And E-Verify alone will, in fact, leave us with an eventual workforce disaster. But the cure for it is not to exclude this bill. This is a very important bill expanding something that's been around since Ken Calvert brought it into Congress before I came. But if we move, and if we have the chairman's commitment, and I'm hoping to get it, that if we can hammer out good bipartisan ag legislation and bring it to this committee, that it will be heard sooner, not later, and that it won't have to languish far behind these enforcement bills, because I believe what we did in the last Congress, or tried to do, we should work together on a bipartisan basis to do it. So I'm going to vote for against your amendment, Susan, and not because I don't agree with you on the problem. I do, but it's not a solution. I'm going to vote for the underlying bill. But, Mr. Chairman, I'd be glad to yield to you in hopes that if we can hammer out bipartisan legislation using your base text, that you would bring that up sooner rather than later.
Well, I thank the gentleman for yielding, and as I indicated in my opening statement, I very much agree with the need to have an agricultural guest worker program. It is critical to the immigration reform process, and I look forward to working with you and the gentlewoman from Washington to achieve a bill that addresses those concerns, and we will take that up as quickly as we can, but we will not know exactly when that'll be until we finish this process that we're in.
Will the gentleman from California yield?
I would further yield to the
I would like to join with you in urging the chairman and Congress as a whole to deal with the agricultural issue. This is a potential problem waiting to happen, and I do think it needs to be addressed right away.
And reclaiming my time for the gentlelady from Washington, I had dinner last night with Howard Berman, a member of this committee I worked with for a long time. He's missed. I'm hoping that you and some of your colleagues, Ms. Lofgren and others, will seriously consider us forming a working group, and let's work on this. Let's figure out if we can't solve a problem that is the biggest single part of the undocumented workforce together. I commit to do it. This is now the committee that I spend 99% of my time at. So if you'll come halfway, I promise you I'll come halfway, and I suspect the gentleman from Texas will come along with us. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence.
Will the gentleman yield?
Of course I yield.
Thank you, and I appreciate the spirit of your remarks on this issue. I know we came together and had bipartisan legislation last Congress that we didn't get across the finish line with respect to comprehensive immigration reform, and I know it's important, I believe, that we look comprehensively because each individual bill creates challenges of its own, just like this one does without other legislation. So I hope we're able to put legislation together to make sure we address this in a comprehensive way to help agriculture, but frankly to help many across our country with the immigration challenges that we face. And I know my farmers said to me, last Congress, there's two things we need. We need a farm bill and we need comprehensive immigration reform. We got one done, but it's important that we get the other one done too.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My farmers only asked for relief. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman,
For the purpose of the gentleman from Michigan, seek recognition.
I'd like to speak in support of the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. This is not complex. The Delbany amendment is for e-verification for agriculture delayed until the Department of Homeland Security, in consultation with the Department, with DOA, certifies that it will not cause a significant agricultural labor shortage. What's wrong with that? I think it's a great idea. It delays verification requirements from applying to seasonal agricultural workers until Homeland Security, in consultation with the Department of Agriculture, certifies that requiring verification of such workers will not cause a significant shortage of persons available to perform labor or services in the United States. We must delay E-Verify in agriculture until Homeland Security and Agriculture certifies that E-Verify won't destroy the nation's agriculture industry. And if we don't exempt ag from the bill's verification requirements altogether, we should at least delay their application to seasonal farm workers until we have confidence that the industry won't be decimated by a loss of workers, which is a very real consideration. This amendment would essentially delay the bill from applying in agriculture until Homeland Security, in consultation with the Department of Agriculture, certifies that the bill's verification requirements will not rob the United States agricultural industry of the stable labor force required to keep the industry alive. Now, the bill is a ticking time bomb for fruit and vegetable agriculture sector. In Georgia and Alabama, mandatory E-Verify has done extensive damage already to the state's farmers and agriculture industry. Without other reforms, nationwide E-Verify will cause huge disruptions in our nation's food system. Over 15% of our economy relies on agriculture, and the industry itself represents 2% of our gross domestic product. Now, over 2/3 of the on-the-field farm workers lack immigration status, and this percentage is growing. Losing those 1 to 1.5 million workers would be devastating. American farms would go under. America would be less secure. And we would see a mass offshoring of jobs, including all of the upstream and downstream American jobs supported by agriculture. There are nowhere near 1.5 million U.S. workers who are willing and able to fill these jobs. You know it, and I know it. Georgia, which recently mandated E-Verify, lost so many farm workers that Governor Nathan Deal, a former colleague, was forced to try to get ex-convicts to fill those jobs. That didn't work, and the Georgia Agribusiness Council reports that Georgia farms have already lost $300 million and may lose up to $1 billion next year. In Alabama, some farmers have reported losing half of their workforce. Rather than heed the lessons from the states, this bill says full speed ahead, damn the torpedoes. Applied nationwide, this bill will have disastrous results. Support this amendment if you care about the nation's agriculture sector. Support this amendment if you want to ensure that U.S. farmers can continue to have access to the labor force they need to grow the food that feeds the nation. Support this amendment if you want to prevent the destruction of our agricultural industry and the millions of American jobs supported by that industry. I thank the chairman.
The committee will stand in recess, and we will reconvene immediately following the vote that's on the floor. There are 2 minutes and 40 seconds left in the vote. Committee will reconvene. When the committee recessed, we were considering amendments to H.R. 1147, including the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Washington, Ms. Delbaney. The question occurs on the amendment offered by the...
Mr. Chairman.
For purpose, the gentleman from Florida seek recognition.
Move to strike last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I strongly support the Delbaney amendment. Under H.R. 1147, the Legal Workforce Act, mandatory E-Verify would not apply to our nation's agricultural industry for 3 years. This amendment would require the Secretary of Homeland Security, in consultation with the Secretary of Agriculture, to certify that the mandatory E-Verify provisions will not cause a significant shortage of people to work in the agricultural industry. Should the Secretary of Homeland Security find that the mandatory E-Verify provisions will cause a significant agricultural labor shortage, then the mandatory E-Verify provisions would not go into effect until the Secretary certifies otherwise. This well-thought-out and critical amendment would ensure that the mandatory E-Verify provisions of the Legal Workforce Act do not have a devastating impact on our nation's agriculture sector, including in my own state of Florida. Currently, more than 75% of the on-the-field farm workers lack immigration status, and this number continues to grow. Mandatory E-Verify could cause the loss of more than 1 to 1.5 million workers in the agriculture industry, and it's well known that there is nowhere near 1 to 1.5 million U.S. workers who are willing to fill these jobs. In addition, a report recently commissioned by the American Farm Bureau Federation found that implementing mandatory E-Verify without a viable agricultural worker program would cause agricultural output to fall by $30 to $60 billion. The report also found that such a policy would cause food prices to increase by 5 to 6%, with domestic fruit production down between 30 and 60%, and vegetable production down 13 to 27%. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to enter this February 2014 report into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The only state whose agricultural industry would be hit harder than Florida would be California. Such impacts to the agricultural industry would send Florida and other states into economic recession, and we can't afford to go backwards. Moreover, mandatory E-Verify for the agricultural community is completely impractical. E-Verify requires access to broadband. However, much of the agricultural communities, many in Florida, do not have access to broadband, and therefore will be unable to use E-Verify to check the status of their workforce. For example, Florida counties such as Eastern Collier County, Henry County, Glades County, and areas just outside my own district in South Florida are dependent upon satellite. Lack of access to broadband exists throughout the rural counties of the state, and this bill would impose impossible compliance requirements on Florida farmers. It would be irresponsible, Mr. Chairman, for Congress to cut off the labor supply for agriculture without having a viable working agricultural guest worker program in existence. Indeed, this committee has yet to schedule a markup on a viable guest worker bill, and there is no guarantee that a revised program would be in place when E-Verify becomes mandatory in accordance with the Legal Workforce Act 3-year time frame. I'd like to thank my colleague, Congresswoman Delbaney, for all of her hard work on this issue and protecting the agricultural community from the impact of mandatory E-Verify. Absent a viable agricultural guest worker bill, mandatory E-Verify would cause a massive loss of agricultural workers, which would devastate agricultural industry and cause irreparable harm to other industries, including food processing, transportation, farm equipment, marketing, and the retail sectors. We absolutely must protect our farmers by having the agricultural sector begin compliance with the E-Verify provisions only once there is a viable legal guest worker system in place. I urge the committee to avert a looming agricultural disaster and support this good amendment. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Washington State. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
Being the chair, the noes have it. Amendment is
Mr.
not
Chair?
agreed to.
Can I ask for a recorded vote?
A recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
No.
Mr. Goodlatte votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith?
No.
Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Forbes? Mr. Forbes votes no. Mr. King? Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Poe? Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes no. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Labrador? Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes no. Ms. Walters? Ms. Walters votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Trott? Mr. Trott votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Conyers?
Aye.
Mr. Conyers votes aye. Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Pierluisi? Ms. Chu? Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Mr. Gutierrez? Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye.
The gentleman from Iowa.
Mr. King votes no.
The gentlewoman from California, Ms. Chu.
Ms. Chu votes aye.
Gentleman from Puerto Rico.
Mr. Pierluisi votes aye.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Yep. Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 11 members voted aye, 16 members voted no.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to
Mr. Chairman,
What purpose the gentleman from Michigan seek
I
recognition?
have an amendment at the desk and ask that it be brought forward.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1147, offered by Mr. Conyers. In Section 2, in the 8th...
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Members of the committee, my amendment corrects a serious imbalance in H.R. 1147 by adding an enforcement mechanism to the bill's worker protections. The Legal Workforce Act contains several requirements intended to protect American workers, but these provisions are really nothing more than mere suggestions without any associated penalties. As we know, H.R. 1147 imposes a series of new mandates on employers, including the requirement that they verify approximately 54 million new hires each year, re-verify current employees in certain circumstances, notify the Department of Homeland Security if the employer chooses not to terminate an employee after receiving a final non-confirmation, and refrain from putting false information into the verification system. Now, if an employer violates these requirements, there are penalties. But when it comes to the bill's protection for American workers and authorized non-citizens, the bill is absolutely silent. For example, 1147 requires employers to notify workers when E-Verify provides a tentative non-confirmation, but it imposes no penalty if the employer fails to comply. In addition, the bill prohibits employers from terminating an employee or rescinding a job offer based on a tentative non-confirmation until that employer receives a final non-confirmation. But again, the bill lacks any penalty provision for violating that protection. And here's a further example. H.R. 1147 requires employers who choose to re-verify an existing employee to also re-verify all other employees at the same geographic location or all employees in the same job category. Once again, the bill fails to subject any employers who break this rule to any penalty. In fact, despite the fact that re-verification is a powerful tool to retaliate against workers at particular job sites or in certain job categories that are organizing for better working protections, this legislation actually bars review of an employer's decision to re-verify the workforce in any government investigation. And so my amendment addresses this oversight by applying the existing penalty structure to violations of these provisions. These changes will better protect United States workers. And finally, my amendment makes the intentional misuse of the verification system an unfair immigration-related employment practice. This will empower the Office of Special Counsel to investigate such abuses and to ensure that persons harmed by unlawful conduct have an opportunity to obtain relief. And so I urge my colleagues on this committee to support this amendment. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment makes sweeping changes to the actions considered in violation of the employment eligibility verification requirements under H.R. 1147, and it strikes provisions designed to make the E-Verify system more employer-friendly. Perhaps most overbroad is the prohibition on an employer taking, quote, adverse employment action against the individual, end quote, seeking work or employed by the employer. Adverse employment action could be almost any action. It is not defined and overly broad. We should be educating our employers about possible inadvertent mistakes, not punishing them for undefined mistakes. And the amendment strikes the provision of H.R. 1147 that allows a job offer to be contingent on the final confirmation of work eligibility. This common sense provision spares an employer from having to go through the process of hiring an individual who turns out not to be work eligible. Again, this language is overly broad and could subject employers to penalties for the smallest of infractions that the Office of Special Counsel at the Department of Justice deems adverse. All of these changes taken together could have a very chilling effect on employers' desire to use E-Verify. So I oppose this amendment because it unduly burdens employers, and I urge my colleagues to also oppose it. Yield back.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
Seeing the chair, the noes have it.
Record vote, please.
Recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
No.
Mr. Goodlatte votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. King votes no. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Poe? Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Marino? Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Labrador? Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes no. Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes no. Ms. Walters? Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Trott? Mr. Trott votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Conyers?
Aye.
Mr. Conyers votes aye. Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Pierluisi votes aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Gutierrez? Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye.
The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Forbes votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 10 members voted aye, 13 members voted no.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to H.R. 1147? For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk that's listed as on the roster as number 3.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1147 offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas. In Section 3, in the proposed
Without objection,
subsection-
the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlewoman is recognized on her amendment for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I know that there is not a disagreement on the importance of knowing who is here to do us harm and who is here to seek an opportunity. I know that most employers would like to adhere by the law.
Exactly the same.
I also know that the system would work much better. Farmers would be protected. Individuals with Hispanic surnames would be protected if we had comprehensive immigration reform. My friends on the other side of the aisle choose not to do it in that way. So my amendment authorizes employer audits by the Department of Homeland Security, Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties that includes the use of testers and provides for the civil liberties and civil rights of those who may be discriminated against incorrectly because of their immigrant-sounding name. This amendment authorizes that process to protect innocent persons, as I indicated. The Legal Workforce Act would mandate the use of E-Verify, an ineffective and expensive employment eligibility verification system that will harm our economy, hurt small businesses, and increase unemployment. Moreover, workers who receive an erroneous E-Verify determination often have to take unpaid time off from work to attempt to correct their records, which may require more than one trip to a government office. A government commission study found that almost half of such workers lost partial or complete days of work, and 14% lost more than 2 days of work as a result of their efforts to correct an E-Verify error. Quite tellingly, the Congressional Budget Office found that the Legal Workforce Act, as reported in the 2013 Congress, would increase federal budget deficits by $30 billion and cost the federal government and U.S. taxpayers over $1.2 billion to implement. In addition to increasing the deficit, the Legal Workforce Act would cost small business billions in out-of-pocket costs, put U.S. citizens and work-authorized non-citizens' jobs at risk, and compound the discriminatory impacts of the current E-Verify system on Latino and foreign-born workers and on working women. The bill does nothing to create jobs, but instead will exacerbate the problems caused by a broken immigration system. What it does do is it puts in jeopardy citizens and others with status who have the right to work. It puts in jeopardy these individuals because of no protections. And so my amendment would add those protections, which I cannot imagine that any of my colleagues here would not wish to ensure that individuals have every right to work in this country would, in fact, do so by supporting this amendment. I would like to submit into the record the Texas Farm Bureau statement that says the risk of an enforcement only approach is too high and the impact on agriculture is so great to watch this go through without informing you of the negative impact and stand along E-Verify. They asked that there be an employment eligibility verification system that is simple and conclusive, provide an affirmative defense for employees who act in good faith, and they also are concerned about the discrimination against employees.
Without objection, be made a part of the record.
Therefore, Mr. Chairman, I ask my colleagues to support the Jackson-Lee amendment, and with that, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment creates additional authorities for the Department of Homeland Security Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, but the Department of Justice Special Counsel, OSC, for immigration-related unfair employment practices already conducts investigations aimed at the prevention of immigration-related discrimination by employers. So this amendment is a solution looking for a problem. In addition, the amendment validates bad faith behavior that will cost businesses scarce time and millions of dollars. Specifically, the amendment requires CRCL to conduct annual audits of E-Verify use. Those audits include the use of testers to determine whether employers use E-Verify properly, the use of random audits to determine employer compliance with civil liberties and civil rights protections, and periodic audits of employers for which CRCL and OSC receives complaints. OSC was created by the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986 specifically to investigate charges and issue complaints under Section 274B of the Immigration and Nationality Act. Section 274B sets out prohibitions on, quote, unfair immigration-related employment practices, end quote. So OSC already accomplishes the goal of this amendment, prosecuting immigration-related discrimination violations. Current law already provides the means to ensure employer compliance with E-Verify, not only through the OSC, but also through the Department of Homeland Security, which is specifically tasked with enforcement of immigration laws, including those relating to the current E-Verify system and the Legal Workforce Act. The point of the Legal Workforce Act is to put Americans back to work. There is no room in the bill for any provision that has the opposite effect. So, Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment and yield back.
Question occurs on the, for purpose, the gentleman from Iowa seek recognition.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to make the point that this bill actually has protections and provisions within it that will establish to avoid even the allegations of using E-Verify for discriminatory purposes. But I think it's important to make the broader point that you can't use E-Verify to discriminate, because the E-Verify database does not register to the employer anything that has to do with race, ethnicity, national origin. It simply verifies whether the identifying documents that are introduced into it identify someone who can lawfully work in the United States. So if you put yourself in the position of an employer that may want to do what Ms. Jackson-Lee is concerned about, all they could do is put employer identification into E-Verify, and the database isn't going to come back and tell you whether it's targeted someone by race, ethnicity, national origin, age, or any other discriminatory property. So I think that, you know, this is a solution looking for a problem, and the E-Verify program has been very reliable and getting better, and it's very good. And if it's going to get too perfect, it's only if we use it to clean up those little pieces on the end. So I'm opposed to this amendment, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to. The chair would advise the committee that we have 8.5 minutes remaining in this vote, and the committee will stand in recess and return for consideration of further amendments immediately after this vote. The committee will reconvene. When the committee recessed, we were considering amendments to H.R. 1147. Are there further amendments to the bill? For purpose, the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1147 offered by Mr. Johnson of Georgia. In Section 2, in the proposed subsection B1C2V, by adding at the end of the following.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment provides critical due process protections for authorized workers who incorrectly receive final non-confirmations. As it is written now, the bill provides no protections for U.S. workers who receive erroneous final non-confirmations. My amendment provides an administrative remedy and an appeals process with judicial review, which allows workers to retain their jobs during the pendency of the appeal, and ensures that back pay and attorney's fees will be provided to workers who lose their jobs due to system or employer error. With 54 million new hires each year that would have to be run through E-Verify, and 155 million people currently in the workforce who could be run through E-Verify, it's projected that 162 to 465,000 authorized workers would be at risk of losing their jobs or job opportunities. The only thing that the bill does for workers who incorrectly lose employment because of E-Verify is to authorize lawsuits for lost wages against the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act. This is a joke. An FTCA lawsuit against the federal government in our crowded federal courts will take months or years, and before filing a suit, the worker would first have to file an administrative claim and wait for either a denial of that claim or the passage of 6 months. In these tough economic times, the worker would be jobless and without pay for this entire period. They will also get nothing if they cannot prove the error resulted from a negligent or wrongful act or admission of any employee of the government. In some cases, the employer who typed their information into the system or the government employee reviewing their information may make an error. Until E-Verify systems and the humans who enter information are able to process information without error, due process is absolutely necessary. Finally, this bill prohibits wrongfully terminated American workers from bringing class action lawsuits under the FTCA. Class action lawsuits are oftentimes the only way people can afford to bring suit. By prohibiting class actions, the Legal Workforce Act will prevent American workers from receiving their day in court. Farms in Georgia have already lost $300 million due to E-Verify, and the impact on the rest of the nation could be disastrous. And with that, I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment is an attempt to make E-Verify compliance burdensome. Its wage compensation provisions incentivize delay tactics in filing appeals, and the amendment overturns Supreme Court precedent that prevents employers from having to pay back wages to illegal immigrants. The Legal Workforce Act balances legitimate concerns of all interested parties regarding E-Verify, the business community, the American people who desire to see immigration laws enforced, and legal employees. But this amendment tips that balance in favor of one party to the detriment of another. Specifically, the amendment creates an administrative process following an E-Verify non-confirmation. So if an individual's employment is terminated or they are not hired based on E-Verify's issuance of a non-confirmation of work eligibility, the individual has access to the administrative and judicial review process. The Legal Workforce Act retains the current deadlines for a final E-Verify verification determination. The bill requires DHS to issue the final determination within 10 working days of the date that an employee or potential employee receives notice of a tentative non-confirmation. However, H.R. 1147 does provide for the process that USCIS has in place to help ensure the resolution of a non-confirmation that is contested by an employee. In those situations, DHS issues a letter requesting that the employer not take action on the final non-confirmation until a resolution has been completed. The average resolution time under this process is only 2.5 days. A final determination deadline is necessary in order to give employers a chance to find another employee, if need be, and to prevent illegal immigrants from occupying scarce jobs. The administrative process created by this amendment allows at least several months before a determination of work eligibility could become final. But in reality, the amendment leaves the process open-ended. There is no actual deadline for the time within which an individual must file the initial administrative appeal. Illegal immigrants could work potentially for years under this amendment as their appeals drag on, and of course this would be an abuse of the process. The lack of a time limit on final determination of work eligibility is an unnecessary burden on U.S. businesses. Companies should have a cutoff date at which point they can move on to find a different employee if need be. Next, the amendment requires that the government compensate the individual for lost wages, reasonable cost, and attorney's fees. That compensation could be upwards of $125,000. U.S. taxpayers should not be required to foot this bill. Furthermore, the bill already allows remedies if an individual alleges that he would not have been dismissed from a job but for an error of the E-Verify system. The individual can file a claim using the Federal Tort Claims Act and seek injunctive relief. The very last provision of the amendment attempts to overturn the 2002 Supreme Court ruling in Hoffman Plastic Compounds versus National Labor Relations Board. The court ruled that the NLRB could not order a company to pay back pay to an illegal immigrant who had been working for Hoffman Plastics. But the amendment specifically states that a former employee's status as an illegal immigrant shall not be a basis for denying back pay remedies to the employee. So under this amendment, businesses will be forced to pay back wages to illegal immigrants. For all of the reasons previously mentioned, I oppose this amendment and hope my colleagues will do the same.
Mr. Chairman.
I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. And what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
Strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is an important consideration, and I hope that we will realize that as presently written, And without this amendment, the measure before us doesn't do anything to prevent workers, U.S. workers, from wrongfully being terminated and increasing our rate of unemployment. And in addition, there is a very important examination of what happens if a worker wins or settles a suit. It will take at least 6 or 8 weeks to get the Justice Department to submit the settlement or judgment to the GAO and for responsible United States Attorney's Office or the Department of Justice Attorney to process the payment. This is a completely inadequate remedy in my view, because workers who lose their jobs due to E-Verify errors, and that can happen, will get nothing if they cannot prove that the error resulted from a negligent or wrongful act or omission of any employee of the government. Well, how in the world do you prove that for a person who's now unemployed? The government also can argue that claims may be barred by various exceptions to government liability. And in a wrongful discharge or negligence case arising out of improper maintenance of a database, for instance, we can expect that the government would raise the discretionary function exception, which is commonly used for the government to defend. So the bottom line is that most workers who will wrongly lose their jobs under H.R. 1147 will never receive any compensation. And those who do could be out of work without pay for up to 8 months. This, my colleagues, I hope you will agree with me, is unacceptable. And so 1147 must include a meaningful administrative and judicial review process. This amendment creates these meaningful due process protections and ensures that U.S. workers don't lose their jobs or pay while they challenge government errors. And so I salute our colleague for coming forward with this amendment, and I hope that it will be made a part of the bill itself. And I thank the chair and yield back the balance of my time.
Chair thanks the gentleman. The question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no.
No.
Opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
As for recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
No.
Mr. Goodlatte votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. King votes no. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Poe? Mr. Poe votes no. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes no. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes no. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Collins? Mr. DeSantis? Ms. Walters? Ms. Walters votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Trott? Mr. Trott votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Conyers? Mr. Conyers votes aye. Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Pierluisi votes aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Gutierrez? Mr. Gutierrez votes aye. Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Peters?
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Forbes.
Mr. Forbes votes no.
The gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Mr. Issa votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 9 members voted aye, 16 members voted no.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to H.R. 1147?
Mr. Chairman, I do have another amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1147 offered by Mr. Johnson. Strike paragraph 8 of section 274A-D of the Immigration and Nationality Act as proposed to be amended by section 3 of the bill and insert the following.
Mr. Chairman, I ask that it be considered as read.
The amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would prevent the government from using a person's information for surveillance purposes. It only allows use of personal information to verify employment or to ensure secure, appropriate, and non-discriminatory use of the verification system. No other purposes would be allowed under my amendment, thus closing a giant loophole in this legislation which is rife with possible consequences unintended. Although deeply flawed, I recognize that E-Verify has its place in comprehensive immigration reform, and I suspect that the Legal Workforce Act will form part of whatever compromise comes out of the House. And that's why we must make sure that it works for Americans. We must get it right. This starts, Mr. Chairman, with privacy, and that's why I want to offer for the record by unanimous consent an email petition from the National Association for Gun Rights, which opposes E-Verify because it establishes a national database which could be used to deny rights to gun owners. Mr. Chairman, we cannot fix the immigration system through mass surveillance or through a national identity system. That's what my amendment is about, making sure that we protect Americans' privacy rights, including the rights of gun owners. We are not a nation of suspects. Courts have long held that the Fourth Amendment prohibition against unlawful searches is a right that is indispensable and essential to our concept of a free and unfettered society. And yet, in the age we live in, law enforcement has powerful tools to lawfully track a person without a warrant. New technologies allow police to easily glean a person's location, communications, or other personal data. But as we've seen with recent disclosures of the secret National Security Agency telephone surveillance, Americans bristle at the notion of surveillance even when our nation's security is at stake. Why would immigration reform be different? We must be careful to prevent effective immigration enforcement from eroding our domestic liberties and civil rights. E-Verify is a system that contains information on almost every American. It includes a long list of information: names, photos, social security numbers, phone numbers, email addresses, and immigration information. This system is swiftly becoming a tool for identifying all workers. The vast collection of personal information for employment verification creates a clear risk for national identity, for a national identity system. And once created, a database with all Americans' personal information would only continue to grow. Such a database would also be in high demand. Everyone from law enforcement to landlords would seek access to it. This could substantially diminish the freedoms of law-abiding citizens. Now, while I am not usually aligned with the National Association for Gun Rights, I am aligned with them on this issue. Today, they spoke out and said the devil's in the data behind any government database, including the E-Verify Dangerous ID system, which is a centralization of dozens of existing federal databases. So again, I would like to offer this online petition by the National Association of Gun Rights for the record via unanimous consent.
Without objection, will be made a part of the record.
And I offer a similar bipartisan amendment. I offered a similar bipartisan amendment last Congress with Representative Shabbat that would limit the use of the database this bill creates. I hope that this is an issue that we can all rally around, regardless of what side of the room you're on. Privacy is important for us all. I ask that my colleagues support my amendment to protect privacy rights, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I oppose the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, as the gentleman from Georgia explained, this amendment consists of two parts. The first part is to say that no national identification card shall be created as a result of the E-Verify program. And I just want to reassure the gentleman that there is actual language in the bill itself that we will not create a national identification card, so he can rest easy on that.
Well, would the chairman, would the gentleman yield?
Yeah, I'd be happy to yield.
Well, not just the card, but the data itself
right.
being used for a purpose not intended by this legislation.
Correct.
Is what the amendment gets at.
And reclaiming my time, I'll now address that because I think the gentleman's concerns are not justified. The gentleman, I think, is implying through this amendment that somehow the E-Verify program creates a new database. It does no such thing. It relies only on existing databases at the Social Security Administration and the Department of Homeland Security. So there are no new databases and therefore no concern about a national ID card. And I would say also no concern about the second provision in the bill, B, that somehow this information is going to be shared with other government agencies that would not be appropriate. So I have to say to the gentleman, I oppose the amendment. I understand and I even appreciate his intentions. I don't necessarily disagree with his intentions because I oppose a national ID card as well, for example. But the amendment is not necessary and, in fact, is predicated upon a false premise. So I oppose the amendment.
Would the gentleman
and
yield?
I'll be happy to yield to the gentleman again.
Thank you. Should this bill pass without this amendment, then the possibilities are that this information can be used down the line for the purposes for which we don't intend it to be used now. And so the purpose of the amendment is to put Congress on record and put this committee on record as being opposed and actually voting affirmatively to ensure that this information in this database, in this E-Verify system, could not be used for anything other than the stated purposes of the legislation.
Yeah, reclaiming my time, Mr. Chairman, let me just say again, I think that the amendment is unnecessary and therefore I oppose the amendment. I would also have to say to the gentleman and to other individuals who might be offering amendments that we haven't had notice of, that it's hard to even consider an amendment unless we have been able to vet it, say, with USCIS. And when we get an amendment without much notice, we really can't make any affirmative decisions without additional knowledge that we simply don't have access to right now. So again, I think the amendment is unnecessary. Be happy to continue to talk to the gentleman between now and the House floor, but at this point and with the language of the amendment, I'll oppose it. Yield back.
The chair recognizes himself in opposition to the amendment. This amendment would prevent information gleaned pursuant to E-Verify use from being used for immigration enforcement or for investigation and prosecution of criminal laws related to identity theft or knowingly employing an illegal immigrant. So the gentleman talks about surveillance, but this amendment is much more broad than that. And there seems to be a misconception that E-Verify is a database of information. It is not. According to USCIS, E-Verify is an internet-based system that compares information from an employee's Form I-9 employment eligibility verification to data contained in the databases of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security and the Social Security Administration to confirm employment eligibility. Some of the already existing databases E-Verify compares information with are the Social Security Administration's Numident database, which contains biographic data on people with Social Security numbers, U.S. Citizenship and Information Services claims databases, which contain information on aliens seeking immigration benefits, Customs and Border Protections, CB Pass database, which contains information allowing officers to verify unexpired passports, ICE's Student and Exchange Visitor System, which maintains information on non-immigrant foreign students and exchange visitors. USCIS RIDE program is an E-Verify tool used to help flag identity theft situations. Under RIDE, USCIS sends the DL number, name, and expiration date submitted by an employer to the state DMV to determine whether or not such a document was issued by the state. The state confirms or denies that such a document was issued. Obviously, if such a document was not issued, then the employee receives a tentative non-confirmation of work eligibility. The state does not share personal information with USCIS. For all of these reasons, I oppose the gentleman's amendment.
Would the gentleman yield?
Be happy to yield.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The amendment just simply provides that no department, bureau, or other agency of the United States government may utilize or share any information, database, or other records assembled under this subsection for any purpose other than employment verification.
Well, reclaiming my time, that's exactly what I just said. And your amendment would stop the use of this information for immigration enforcement itself. It would stop the use of the information for prosecution of criminal laws. It would stop the use of information to prevent and prosecute identity theft or employment of people who are not authorized to be employed. So that, coupled with the fact that there's no database to begin with, to me, would argue strongly against your amendment.
Mr. Chairman, would the chairman yield again?
Chairman would be happy to yield.
Thank you. The devil is in the details of this legislation. There are a lot of opportunities for misuse of this information. This amendment simply limits the use of the information to the intended purposes of the legislation itself, which is to
reclaiming my time, the gentleman just said it only applied to surveillance. Now he says it prevents it from being used for any other purpose.
I did not say
the second interpretation is correct, and I don't agree that if you discover that somebody is not eligible for employment, that information should not be used to prosecute someone for identity theft if that's the action that they're engaged in at the time that they participate in this.
Well,
so,
is the chairman suggesting that the intended purpose of this legislation is to use the information for something other than employment verification?
The law allows the use right now under the voluntary employment verification system that 580,000 employers use. The law allows that information to be used for other purposes. If it discovers that an illegal act is taking place, it can report that illegal act.
And Mr. Chairman, would you yield to me?
I would be happy to yield.
Briefly, let me direct the gentleman from Georgia to page 36 of the bill. Section 4, design and operation of the system, and let me read briefly from it. The verification system shall be designed and operated with appropriate administrative, technical, and physical safeguards to prevent unauthorized disclosure of personal information. And then on page 40, Section 8, limitation on use of the verification system and any related systems. No national identification card. Nothing in this section shall be construed to authorize, directly or indirectly, the issuance or use of national identification cards or the establishment of a national identification card. Those two sections in the bill directly respond to the two sections in the gentleman's amendment.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Georgia. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Being the chair, the noes have it.
Call for a
Amendment's not
record
agreed to.
vote.
Record vote is requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
No.
Mr. Goodlatte votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. King votes no. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Poe? Mr. Poe votes no. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes no. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes yes. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Collins? Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes no. Ms. Walters? Ms. Walters votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Trott? Mr. Trott votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Conyers? Mr. Conyers votes aye. Mr. Nadler? Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Pierluisi votes aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Gutierrez? Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye.
The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Forbes.
Mr. Forbes votes no.
The gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Chaffetz votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 10 members voted aye, 14 members voted no.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to H.R. 1147?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
Gentlewoman from California, seek recognition.
I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment. There apparently are two amendments.
Right. This is the one on increasing penalties for unfair immigration-related employment practices.
I believe that's 003.
Amendment to H.R. 1147, offered by Ms. Chu of California. In Section 8, insert A, unlawful employment of
Without
bill.
objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Mr. Chair, the underlying bill significantly increases the penalties on employers who do not use the verification program or misrepresents information, but it does not protect workers from unfair immigration-related employment practices by similarly raising those penalties. My amendment makes sure that both sets of penalties are increased equally. We already know that E-Verify will tempt people to discriminate, even if there is no malice behind it. In Georgia, where E-Verify is mandatory for all employers with more than 10 employees, there have been reports of workers being turned away just because of their national origin. Just before the law was enacted, the CL Atlanta quoted a chef who refused to be named in the paper as saying, quote, "I recently put out an ad for a cook, and I got about 50 applications. I threw out all the ones that looked to be Mexican because we knew this law was coming down, and we didn't want to deal with it. I don't know if those folks are legal or not, but I just didn't want to even have to think about it," unquote. Now, under current law, this type of discrimination based on national origin or citizenship is prohibited. But without an increase in penalties for employers who might turn away applicants, we must make sure the law will be enforced so that there is a strong disincentive against discrimination. As we implement E-Verify, I can't help but worry discrimination will happen more and more often. In the Georgia case, all of those applicants could have been legal workers or even American citizens. Without my amendment, we cannot be sure that the bill will not increase discrimination and make it harder for legal workers, including authorized workers and U.S. citizens who are trying to find work in this tough economy. This bill, as written, will hurt U.S. citizen workers who are just trying to find a job and make a living for their families. My amendment will go a long way to ensure employer accountability and protect U.S. citizens from discrimination. Thank you, and I yield back.
What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes, and the gentleman is thanked for the compliment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, this amendment increases penalties for unfair immigration-related employment practices under 274B of the Immigration and Nationality Act. It is a common complaint of employers that the Office of Special Counsel for Immigration-Related Unfair Employment Practices is overzealous in their pursuit of claims against employers for use of discriminatory tactics, even in cases in which the employer acted inadvertently and without malice. For instance, employers have been held liable by OSC when the software they purchased to help run their I-9 compliance contains a formatting error of which the employer had no knowledge. Under this amendment, the penalties for such perceived violations, since they are strict liability, would be greatly increased. So I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Yield back.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. All those in favor respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
No.
Mr. Goodlatte votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Issa? Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. King votes no. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Poe? Mr. Poe votes no. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Marino? Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes no. Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes no. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Collins? Mr. DeSantis? Mr. DeSantis votes no. Ms. Walters? Ms. Walters votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Trott? Mr. Trott votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Conyers?
Aye.
Mr. Conyers votes aye. Mr. Nadler?
Aye.
Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Pierluisi votes aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Gutierrez? Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Ms. Del Bene? Ms. Del Bene votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Peters? Mr. Peters votes aye.
The gentleman from Ohio?
Mr. Shabbat votes no.
Gentleman from Virginia?
Mr. Forbes votes no.
Gentleman from Utah?
Mr. Chaffetz votes no.
Gentleman from Florida?
Mr. Deutsch votes aye.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 12 members voted aye, 17 members voted no.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to H.R. 1147?
Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1147 offered by Ms. Chu of California. In Section 3 in the proposed...
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes on her amendment.
Mr. Chair, this bill contains some improvements for small business that will be negatively impacted by mandatory E-Verify, but they don't go far enough.
What is this amendment?
My amendment would eliminate the cost for small businesses to implement the new burdensome government regulations created under this bill, and instead have the government foot the bill for immigration enforcement, just as it does today. This bill forces small businesses to act as de facto law enforcement officers for the federal government at a time when they're just trying to get by in today's tough economy. The loss of jobs will be staggering as employers substitute machinery for employees or outsource employment to avoid the vexations and costs of compliance. The first year this bill goes into effect, it could cost a single small business as much as $24,500 to get this onerous program up and running. Mom and pop business owners will need to take time off from work to sign the appropriate memorandum of understanding with the government. Management time will be diverted to training. They will have to memorize the 88 long pages user manual for employers that will tell them how to comply. And then there's the 3-hour tutorial and the knowledge tests they will have to pass just to administer the program. Small businesses will be forced to do mounds of additional paperwork to comply with the regulations. They will need armies of expensive attorneys to safeguard against any unintended mistakes, and they will lose productive hours while employees take time off to get their records fixed. And in the case of wrongful terminations, lose highly qualified, trained employees altogether. All told, according to a study by Bloomberg Government mandating E-Verify for new hires, that would cost small businesses with fewer than 500 employees about $2.6 billion every year to verify new hires through the system. These costs would increase under this bill because it requires checks on many existing employees as well as new hires. These costs are especially burdensome because small businesses don't already have a big HR department dedicated to personnel matters. Today, many larger businesses hire private firms to handle E-Verify requirements. Small businesses won't be able to absorb the costs of outsourcing these responsibilities. Additionally, my amendment will ensure that Congress and the public understands the true cost of implementing E-Verify on our small businesses by requiring an annual report on the financial burden on E-Verify compliance on small businesses. As a member of the Small Business Committee, I just don't think it makes sense to add an expensive and burdensome requirement on our small businesses during these tough economic times. My amendment will relieve some of the crushing costs of mandatory E-Verify while making sure we have a full and accurate information about how this legislation will impact them. My amendment will make it easier for small businesses to grow and hire new workers, not make it more onerous as this bill does. Thank you, and I yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment creates a grant program to meet an unproved need. I understand why E-Verify opponents would like for small businesses to be scared of an E-Verify requirement. Fortunately, the facts are indisputable and show that an E-Verify requirement will not burden small businesses. According to U.S. economic census data, 61% of all businesses in America employ fewer than 5 people, and 95% of all employers in America employ fewer than 100 workers, and many are not hiring in today's economy. So the smallest businesses won't be impacted immediately by H.R. 1147's E-Verify requirement, since for the most part, the bill applies E-Verify to new hires only. Furthermore, small businesses have 2 years for the phase-in of the E-Verify program. Companies with 10,000 or more employees are only 1% of American businesses, but they employ about 27% of the workforce. These large companies, not small businesses, are the ones doing most of the hiring in this economy. To the extent that making changes to the current E-Verify system can make it easier for small businesses to use, H.R. 1147 does so. For instance, the bill requires the creation of a telephone E-Verify option. Opponents of a national E-Verify requirement often cite a January 2011 Bloomberg government study that claims an E-Verify requirement would cost small businesses over $2 billion. But that study is flawed. First, it doesn't allow for technological improvements that have occurred since that time and that make E-Verify easier to use and much less costly. In fact, it often costs nothing. Second of all, the false Bloomberg poll relies on job turnover data that includes all changes of employment within a company, not just new hires. So it's a greatly inflated cost. In fact, economists believe that the data on which the Bloomberg study relies actually overstates new hires. This is significant since an E-Verify requirement will, for the most part, again, only apply to new hires, not to every employee. Those who cite the Bloomberg government study fail also to note that the 2009 Westat study on which Bloomberg relied actually said, even back then, that 76% of all employers found that there were no costs associated with starting to use E-Verify. So E-Verify use is not a significant cost to small businesses, and there is no need for the grant program created by this amendment. So I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment. Yield back.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from California. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
No.
Mr. Goodlatte votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. King votes no. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Poe. Mr. Poe votes no. Mr. Chaffetz. Mr. Marino. Mr. Marino votes no. Mr. Gowdy. Mr. Gowdy votes no. Mr. Labrador. Mr. Labrador votes no. Mr. Farenthold. Mr. Collins. Mr. DeSantis. Ms. Walters. Ms. Walters votes no. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe. Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott votes no. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Conyers.
Aye.
Mr. Conyers votes aye. Mr. Nadler. Aye. Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee. Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Preloisi. Mr. Preloisi votes aye. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu votes aye. Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Mr. Gutierrez. Ms. Bass. Mr. Richmond. Ms. Delbene. Ms. Delbene votes aye. Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes aye.
The gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Forbes votes no.
Gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Jordan votes no.
Gentleman from Utah.
Mr. Chaffetz votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 12 members voted aye, 19 members voted no.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to H.R. 1147?
Mr. Chairman,
For purpose, the gentleman from Florida seek recognition.
I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1147 offered by Mr. Deutsch. In Section 274A.
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My amendment would strike the provision in Section 3 of the Legal Workforce Act that prohibits class actions from being brought by workers who unjustly lose their jobs due to an error in the E-Verify system. This provision would eliminate any legal recourse for thousands of workers who might lose their job due to database error, and will remove the ability of the courts to effectively and efficiently resolve cases involving large numbers of workers who are harmed by similar systemic E-Verify errors. Class actions, Mr. Chairman, are an essential means by which the courts can effectively address claims that are systemic in nature or impact a large number of people in a similar manner. Cases that would be too expensive to litigate on an individual case-by-case basis are often raised as class actions. Accordingly, class actions enable individuals who are not in a position financially to bring their own lawsuits to have a court hear and adjudicate their claims as part of a group of people similarly impacted. Class actions also enable a court to efficiently administer their dockets to resolve cases involving a large number of people who are being harmed by a similar practice, rather than having to resolve numerous individual cases. In describing the important legal procedure that later became the class action, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story recognized that it is general rule in equity that all persons materially interested, either as plaintiffs or defendants, in the subject matter of the bill ought to be made parties to the suit, however numerous they may be. And the court could make a complete decree between the parties and prevent future litigation by taking away the necessity of a multiplicity of suits. Section 3 of the Legal Workforce Act creates a process for individuals to seek protection in the courts if that individual, quote, would not have been dismissed from a job but for an error of the verification mechanism. This section of the law permits the individual to seek compensation through the Federal Tort Claims Act and injunctive relief to correct the verification error. Inexplicably, the section also prohibits class actions from being filed to seek relief for a verification error that may have occurred under the E-Verify system. This prohibition against class actions would tie the hands of the overburdened federal courts to effectively manage their dockets and address potential E-Verify error problems having similar characteristics involving a large number of individuals, and to provide adequate relief to those individuals and to provide relief as well. Moreover, this provision would prevent employees of limited finances to seek relief in the courts should they lose their jobs due to an E-Verify error. The Legal Workforce Act provides an exclusive recourse for a worker who unjustly loses his job due to an E-Verify error. These individual workers can only seek lost wages against the federal government under the Federal Tort Claims Act or injunctive relief. This creates yet another barrier for aggrieved individuals to receive back pay for losing their jobs from an E-Verify error. The fee cap on attorneys makes it financially impractical for an attorney to represent an aggrieved lower-income individual against the federal government on a contingency basis to recover lost wages. Indeed, under this bill, cases seeking lost wages filed by aggrieved individuals will be very costly. These cases will have to be filed in federal court, which will take months and in some cases years to resolve. In these instances, a class action may be the only way for a group of individuals to receive legal representation to have their case against the federal government heard in federal court for wages they unjustly lost as a result of an E-Verify error. Because a class action lawsuit could be the best method for individual workers who lose their jobs for similar E-Verify errors to have their cases heard in court, and permits a court to efficiently manage its docket and consolidate claims into one case, I urge support of my amendment. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
What purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I oppose the amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to Federal Rules of Civil Procedure, class actions may be brought where the class is so large as to make individual suits impractical, and there is a legal and factual claim in common among the class members. Termination on grounds of employment eligibility are fact-specific. There is absolutely no justification for class actions, as each individual who alleges they were wrongfully terminated based upon the system being used for verification processes has unique circumstances surrounding the determination. Further, the bill provides remedies for individuals who may be harmed by employers who utilize the system. But employers already are subject to penalties if they misuse the system. Additionally, if an individual was harmed on account of using the system, the Legal Workforce Act allows individuals to file suit using the Federal Tort Claims Act. In addition, advocates for illegal immigration in activist courts, such as the Ninth Circuit, would be tempted to use this class action to shut down E-Verify through injunction. They will use this very argument. They will use every argument they can think of to prevent the rollout of E-Verify. They know that E-Verify will prevent illegal immigrants from getting jobs and saving jobs for American workers. Class actions are simply not appropriate under these circumstances, and I urge my colleagues to oppose the amendment and yield back.
Question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. Opinion of the chair, the noes have it. Amendment is not agreed to.
I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
No.
Mr. Goodlatte votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith?
No.
Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Issa? Mr. Issa votes no. Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. King votes no. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Poe? Mr. Poe votes no. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Marino? Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes no. Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes no. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. DeSantis? Ms. Walters? Ms. Walters votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Trott? Mr. Trott votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Conyers? Mr. Conyers votes aye. Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee? Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Pierluisi votes aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Mr. Gutierrez? Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Peters?
Gentleman from Virginia.
Mr. Forbes votes no.
Gentleman from Ohio.
Mr. Jordan votes no.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Mr. Marino votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 11 members voted aye, 18 members voted no.
The amendment is not agreed to. Are there further amendments to H.R. 1147 for purposes the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 1147 offered by Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island. In Section 274A...
Without objection, the amendment is considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If enacted, this bill would require the universal use of E-Verify for entities that receive payment for referring individuals for employment. The one and only exception to this receipt of payment rule is that all unions and day labor centers would also be required to use E-Verify, even though the bill recognizes they receive no payment whatsoever for providing recruitment or referral services. These entities are not employers. They will not benefit from the employee's services, yet this language forces them to bear the costs of verification and removes the burden from employers to make sure their employees qualify for work. This provision is designed to hurt unions who are simply working to protect workers and find them employment. My amendment would merely place unions and hiring halls on the same level footing as other nonprofit entities that refer employees and serve to grow the economy. Currently, this bill says nothing about whether employers who hire a worker referred by a union as an independent contractor will have to use E-Verify. If employers do not have to verify employment eligibility, requiring unions to use E-Verify inappropriately puts the cost and responsibility on the union rather than the employer. The language is unclear, but if in fact employers will still have to verify the employment eligibility of referred workers, the provision is redundant and doesn't advance the goals of the legislation. The only thing it would do is advance the purely political goal of harming the ability of labor unions to organize and represent the rights of workers. The bill we're discussing today also allows for the selective re-verification of existing workers and prohibits the federal review of any decision that follows. I'm concerned that this provision provides a tool to target workers organizing for better wages and improved working conditions. This legislation would further enable this kind of abuse, while employers who actively suppress organizing activities or discriminate against certain classes of workers. My amendment would eliminate this provision, allowing for selective re-verification, thus removing the potential for abuse, and allow unions to operate without undue costs and interference. I ask for your support of this important reform, and thank you for your consideration of the amendment, and yield back.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Texas seek recognition? Oh, I'm sorry. What purpose does the gentleman from Iowa seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition to the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise in opposition to the Cicilline amendment, and it happens to go directly into an amendment that I had offered on this previous markup of the same bill in the previous Congress. That my concern has been that the original bill was drafted in such a way that if you were, say, a franchisor and you had restaurants all over the country, if you were going to e-verify a single employee at a single location under that underlying language that this would revert to, you would end up having to e-verify every employee in all the states of the union, perhaps. And I think that's an onerous burden on the part of an employer. It gives actually a small company an advantage when it comes to this. But a single location or a single job category should be adequate. We had a long discussion on this in the previous markup of the similar bill, and came to a conclusion that this House Judiciary Committee came to the conclusion that it was reasonable to provide that an employer check all job categories or all employees at a single location rather than compel them to check all of their employees. Myself, philosophically, I want to go on record telling you that E-Verify cannot logically be used to discriminate against anyone on the basis of race, creed, color, religion, national origin, marital status, or age, or any other category that I can think of. E-Verify does, if it does know those things, it doesn't divulge them to the employer who is using E-Verify. Therefore, the allegations that it can be used against labor organization or against individuals by any of these categories, I believe are logically false, and we've been through this debate a number of times before. So I rise in opposition to this amendment. We have a logical solution written into the underlying bill, and I certainly support the underlying bill and the logic that is written within it. I'd urge opposition and a no vote on this amendment, and I'd yield back the balance of my time.
Would the gentleman from Iowa yield the balance of his time?
I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Texas.
I thank the gentleman from Iowa. Mr. Chairman, I also oppose this amendment. It strikes provisions specifically designed to ensure that U.S. jobs go to Americans and legal workers. Millions of Americans want a full-time job but can't find one. Yet there are an estimated 7 million unlawful immigrants in the current workforce. And the gentlewoman from California offers an amendment that will help protect jobs for unlawful aliens. The Legal Workforce Act requires day labor centers, union hiring halls, and other labor service entities to use E-Verify for those individuals they refer or recruit for employment, regardless of whether or not they receive payment for doing so. This amendment alters the text so only entities that receive payment for recruiting or referring employees are required to use E-Verify on the individuals they recruit or refer. Many localities around the country have opened day labor sites to provide places where workers, mostly illegal immigrants, are matched with employers seeking labor for one day and other short-term work. Localities that open these sites are deliberately seeking to aid illegal immigrants and employers in evading immigration laws. Section 4 of H.R. 1147 requires localities that set up day labor sites to use E-Verify to check the employment eligibility of those seeking jobs at the sites. It helps ensure that illegal immigrants do not obtain employment through the day labor sites. All entities that recruit or refer potential employees should be required to use E-Verify to help ensure that potential employees' work eligibility. Exemption from this requirement, simply based on the fact that they don't receive a fee for the referral or recruitment, doesn't make sense to me. So I'll yield back to the gentleman from Iowa.
And reclaiming my time, I thank the gentleman from Texas, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The question occurs on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Rhode Island. All those in favor respond by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
No. Being the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte? Mr. Goodlatte votes no. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes no. Mr. Shabbat? Mr. Shabbat votes no. Mr. Isa? Mr. Forbes? Mr. King? Mr. King votes no. Mr. Franks? Mr. Franks votes no. Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes no. Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes no. Mr. Poe? Mr. Poe votes no. Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes no. Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes no. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes no. Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes no. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes no. Mr. DeSantis? Ms. Walters? Ms. Walters votes no. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes no. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes no. Mr. Trott? Mr. Trott votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Conyers? Mr. Conyers votes aye. Mr. Nadler? Mr. Nadler votes aye. Ms. Lofgren? Ms. Lofgren votes aye. Ms. Jackson Lee?
Aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Pierluisi? Mr. Pierluisi votes aye. Ms. Chu? Ms. Chu votes aye. Mr. Deutsch? Mr. Deutsch votes aye. Mr. Gutierrez?
Thank you.
Ms. Bass? Mr. Richmond? Ms. Delbene? Ms. Delbene votes aye. Mr. Jeffries? Mr. Jeffries votes aye. Mr. Cicilline? Mr. Cicilline votes aye. Mr. Peters?
The gentleman from Virginia?
Mr. Forbes votes no.
Gentleman from California?
Mr. Isa votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report.
Mr. Chairman, 11 members voted aye, 20 members voted no.
And the amendment is not agreed to. Are there any other amendments? A reporting quorum being present, the question is on the motion to report the bill H.R. 1147 favorably to the House. Those in favor will respond by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. Opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the bill, a recorded vote is requested, and the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Goodlatte?
Aye.
Mr. Goodlatte votes aye. Mr. Sensenbrenner? Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith votes aye. Mr. Shabbat?
Good work.
Mr. Isa? Mr. Isa votes aye. Mr. Forbes? Mr. Forbes votes aye. Mr. King? Mr. King votes aye. Mr. Franks? Mr. Gomert? Mr. Gomert votes aye. Mr. Jordan?
That's the first recorded aye from Louis Gohmert.
Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Poe?
Just 2 days. Okay.
Mr. Chaffetz? Mr. Chaffetz votes aye. Mr. Marino? Mr. Marino votes yes. Mr. Gowdy? Mr. Gowdy votes yes. Mr. Labrador? Mr. Labrador votes yes. Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Collins? Mr. Collins votes yes. Mr. DeSantis? Ms. Walters? Ms. Walters votes aye. Mr. Buck? Mr. Buck votes aye. Mr. Ratcliffe? Mr. Ratcliffe votes yes. Mr. Trott. Mr. Trott votes yes. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes yes. Mr. Conyers. Mr. Conyers votes no. Mr. Nadler. Mr. Nadler votes no. Ms. Lofgren. Ms. Lofgren votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee.
No.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Cohen. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson votes no. Mr. Pierluisi. Ms. Chu. Ms. Chu votes no. Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Deutsch votes no. Mr. Gutierrez. Ms. Bass. Mr. Richmond. Ms. Del Bene. Ms. Del Bene votes no. Mr. Jeffries. Mr. Jeffries votes no. Mr. Cicilline. Mr. Cicilline votes no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters votes no.
Gentleman from Puerto Rico.
Mr. Pierluisi votes no.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Poe.
Mr. Poe votes yes.
Gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Shabbat.
Mr. Shabbat votes yes.
Gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Franks.
Mr. Franks votes yes.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Mr. Cohen votes no.
Has every member voted who wishes to vote? Clerk will report. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, 20 members voted aye, 13 members voted no.
The ayes have it, and the bill is ordered reported favorably to the House. Members will have 2 days to submit views. The
Chairman.
from Texas is recognized for unanimous consent request.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to place in the record my vote for the Delbany Amendment, which I was detained on due to being in a meeting on racial profiling. I would have voted aye if I'd been present. Ask that it be placed appropriately in the record.
We can note it in the record. We can't take the vote for the purposes of the count, but we will note in the record your statement.
I understand. I thank you.
And I ask unanimous consent
yield
that
back.
letters or statements in support of the Legal Workforce Act from the following groups be entered into the record: Numbers USA, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the National Restaurant Association, the National Association of Home Builders, the International Franchise Association, National Federation of Independent Business, and Leading Builders of America. Without objection, they will be made a part of the record. I thank all members for their participation today, and we will continue with the markup tomorrow morning. At what time? At 10 a.m. See you then.
Mr. Chairman,
For what purpose, the gentlewoman from
do
California?
you know what the order that we will be taking these up tomorrow?
We'll stick with the order listed on the notice, but
Okay,
I don't
thank
have that right in front of me.